What do you do when you have an image of a graph, but you want to get the data? Now, this might be from a publication, a website, a PDF, or it could be a graph that somebody else created in the organization, maybe in the past, and you don't have the data or you can't find the data, but you want the data because you want to apply it in a graph you're creating now. This is Dave Perry, and in this video, I'm going to show you a couple of methods for accurately estimating the data from an image of a graph. Let's walk through the steps and the two methods, and we'll see how we can do this to get pretty accurate estimates of the values of the data in this graph. The first step is to get an image of the graph into PowerPoint. So in the background here, I have a PowerPoint file open just with a blank slide. And one of the ways you can do it is actually just capture an image from a website if that's where it's coming from. So this is an image here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the image, and there's an item here called Copy Image. And what copying the image does, so I'll click on that, and then I can go to PowerPoint and just go Control V, paste, and it pastes the image in. The problem with this is that the image is going to come in at whatever resolution the website had it at, which in often, a lot of cases, is going to be quite low resolution. The reason being is that websites are meant to be viewed online. So it doesn't need to be super high resolution, and high resolution images take longer to load on a website. You can tell it's going to be a little low resolution, first of all, by the size. And the second thing is when I make this bigger, let's say I want to fill most of the slide, you'll notice you can start to see how it gets fuzzy. Let me zoom in on there. See how the text is getting fuzzy, the lines are getting fuzzy. That's going to make it a little harder to know what the estimate of the value is. So that's one way to get it in. The other way, and actually the preferred way, is to use a PDF. Now, this particular website has a PDF, and I suggest you open the PDF in the Edge browser, which is what you're seeing here. And then the graph that I'm going to work with is this graph here. So what we want to do is we're going to take a screen capture, but it's going to be a high resolution screen capture. I'm going to zoom in on this chart. So I'm going to use my zoom tool here to zoom in on the PDF, and I'm going to make it as big as I possibly can in my window here on the browser. So I'll scroll down so I can get it. Wow, that's nice and big. That's exactly what I want. Now I'm going to just do a regular screen capture. So in Windows, I'm just going to go Windows Shift S, those three keys together. That's going to give me my cursor that I can now draw a rectangle around the area that I want to capture. I've got my whole graph here. I release my capture, and now I can go to PowerPoint and I can go Control V, paste. Look at how much larger that graph is because it's much higher resolution. This is the preferred way to get a graph into your PowerPoint slide. And in most cases, the PDF is going to have a high resolution image because it's meant for printing. That's why it has a high resolution image. So step number one is to get our graph, the image of our graph, into our blank PowerPoint slide. In this first method, we're going to add additional grid lines between the existing grid lines on this graph so we can get a better estimate of the value. Because right now, for example, this column here, it's okay, it's between 1.5 and 2, but if we estimate it here, it's not as good as if we had additional grid lines. We're going to add those on using lines that we draw on top of this graph. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a perfectly horizontal line to start positioning where we want to do. Now, before we do that, when you start to draw things, PowerPoint has some defaults that you're going to want to turn off for the purpose of this estimating. The defaults automatically position objects that you draw or you move, sometimes in relation to a grid or in relation to other objects. This limits your ability to position them exactly where you want. So before you get started on drawing anything, let's turn those settings off. I'm going to go to a blank area of the slide now. Because this graph takes up most of the slide, I'm going to have to go right to the edge here. I'm going to right click, and in this menu, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Grid and Guides item. I'm going to click on that, and it opens up the dialog box. And two of these settings are normally turned on, so I'm going to ask you to turn them off just for this purpose. The first is Snap Objects to Grid. What this does is it positions any object you draw within the grid as defined. You can see the grid spacing here is every 1/12 of an inch. So we're going to turn that off, so this means we can draw an object exactly where we want. And the other one to turn off is this item here, Display Smart Guides when shapes are aligned. I'm going to turn that off because what this particular setting does is it actually moves an object to a relationship with another object and doesn't give you that ability to position it exactly where you want. So I'm going to turn those off and I'm going to click OK. Now that we've got our PowerPoint settings, again, you're going to want to turn those back on after we're done, but just for the purposes of this estimating. First thing I'm going to do is draw that perfectly horizontal line. And the way we do this, I'm going to use my line tool, and I'm going to use the Shift key to keep it straight. So I'm going to go and get my usual line tool here, and I'm going to draw a line. So I'm going to hold the Shift key down, then I'm going to draw the line. You notice my cursor can go off of perfectly horizontal, and the line is still exactly horizontal. Then I'll release. Now I'm going to make this line quite thin because I do, again, want to see the columns and not a thicker line. So I'm going to go to my shape outline here, and under the weight, I'm going to select the thinnest, which is 1/4 point. I also want this line to be a different color than the grid lines. Now the grid lines here are a gray, which is fairly typical. So I'm going to have this as the blue. I'm going to leave that as the blue. Now what I want to do is I want to position it exactly on top of one of the grid lines. I'm going to use this top section to start with. Now I could do that and just drag it and sort of hope that it's positioned there, but hoping isn't good enough when we want a really good, accurate estimate. So I'm going to zoom in on this slide. I'm going to go down to the bottom corner here, and I'm going to use the zoom tool. So this is the zoom setting, and it's normally just makes the slide as big as whatever space you have on the screen. I'm going to zoom in, and it zooms in. You'll notice it's zooming in here, and I'm going to zoom it in. Let's say let's get it really big, 250%. Now I can see that that line is close, but it's actually, I'm going to go all the way over the side here, it's actually a little bit below where that gray line is. So I've selected my blue line, and I want to move it up just a little bit at a time. Now I could do that and grab it, and to move it perfectly vertically, I can hold the Shift key down and then move the line so it's perfectly vertical and get it where I want it. Now, the other thing I could do is if I wanted to move it 1 pixel at a time, I can hold the Control key down and move it with the up or down arrow keys, and that moves it 1 pixel at a time. Now what I've got is I've got my one line perfectly where I want it to be on top of one of the grid lines. Now I'm just going to duplicate this line 10 more times. So I have a total of 11 lines. The easy way to duplicate is not Control C and Control V. It's to use Control and Shift and then drag. So what Control Shift drag does is it duplicates the line, but it keeps it in that vertical alignment with the original object. So I've selected my line. I hold Control Shift down on my keyboard. You notice how the cursor changes to have a little plus beside the cursor. That means it's duplicating. Now I'm going to drag this line down just a little bit and keep doing that. So I've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now this last one I want to position exactly on top of the next adjacent grid line in the graph, which here is the 1.5. So again, I'll hold my Shift key down, move it down until it's a little too low. I want to move it just that one cursor or 1 pixel, so I'll move it down just the 1 pixel. Okay, now I've got it on. So I've now got my additional 10 segments. This gives me a lot more accuracy when I want to estimate it, but they're not evenly spaced. I need them evenly spaced because otherwise it's not accurate. Easy to do that using the tools within PowerPoint. I'm going to select all of these lines. Now, the tough thing about trying to click and control click is the lines are so close to each other. This is where the selection pane is very helpful. I'm going to go up to my shape format ribbon, which is already selected because I've selected this line. And I'm going to turn on the selection pane. And the selection pane, what it does, it shows you all the objects on the slide in a list on the right-hand side. Now what I can do is I can select this particular one, and then I can control click on each of the other lines. Now they're called straight connectors. That's what a line is called in PowerPoint. That's what they call it. So now I've selected all 11 of them. I'm going to go to the Align tool. I'm going to zoom in here for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say not alignment, I'm going to say distribute vertically. What this is going to do is going to equally distribute them from the top to the bottom object in the selection that I've made. When I click distribute vertically, now I have 10 equally spaced segments that give me the ability to accurately estimate the value. I don't want to get them out of alignment. So what I'm going to do is the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go back up to the ribbon here and I'm going to say group them. This creates a group of these lines. This is valuable because I'm going to now be able to duplicate this down to other sections of the graph that I need to estimate the height of a column. I can close my selection pane because I don't need that anymore. Now what I can do is I can move over to where the columns are that I need to estimate. Here we go. So this column here, see now it's a lot easier for me to know where exactly is the value. So I know that now each of the little segments that I've added is 0.05 because it was 0.5, I divided it by 10, so 0.05. Now when I'm estimating, I start at 1.5, so 1.55, 1.6, 65, 7, 7, 5, 8, 1.85. So it's in between 1.85 and 1.9. It looks to be almost halfway, so I'm going to say it's 1.87. See how this has given me the ability to accurately estimate. So 1.87. I'm going to go back to my item here, and my estimate here is going to be 1.87. So I'm going to enter my estimates into Excel, and then we're going to check. This data actually does exist. That's why I selected this example, so that we can test how good are the estimates. Now, I'm going to zoom back out. So I'm going to use this button here down at the bottom, the one that kind of looks like it has 4 directions. When I click on that, it resets the zoom to be exactly the size of the slide that we have the area in our PowerPoint window. Now I can move this particular set of 10 lines, duplicate them down to where I need them to be. So I'm going to, let's do the next set being here between the 0 and the minus 0.5. Let's do some estimates there. So I'm going to, again, I want to duplicate this and move it perfectly vertical. So the Control Shift is what we're going to do. So I'm going to Control Shift, and I'm going to drag this group down and position it, again, approximately where it needs to be. But I know that's not going to be perfect. Again, I'll zoom in. Let's zoom into our 250% again, or close to it. And now I can, again, shift and drag, and I make sure that blue line is right on top of the grid line at the top and the bottom. That looks good. Now, my estimates here. So I've got my, let's see, what's our item, this small item here. So state and local government spending. So that looks to me like it is approximately minus 0.5. I think this is a little low. So I'm going to move this up a bit. That looks better. So it looks to be minus 0.05 to me. So let's enter that into our minus 0.05. And our next estimate, the previous one, so 0.5, 0.05, 0.1, 0.2, so minus 0.25, that's what that looks like. Here, minus 0.25. And our next one here looks like it's about minus 0.45 lines up fairly well with that there. So minus 0.45. So you see how what we're doing is I'm using this set of 10 lines that allows me to now look at my graph and be able to divide it much more finely and determine what those values really are. And I'm zooming in and zooming out. I'm moving the set of 10 lines to take a look at how I can accurately estimate. So let's take a look and see how close was I on those 4 items that I estimated using this method. I'm going to go to my data from the source, and I'm going to copy my values here. These are the values that are actually from the data table that they give us, and paste them here. And so what have we got here? So our minus 0.45, exactly. Minus 0.25, exactly. 1.87, 1.88, very, very close. 0.05 and minus 0.6. I think that's probably because I misread the number here. No, it's because I mistyped it in my data here. This is supposed to, let's just check. We're going to go to the actual data from this is the data from that government, and it's in table 2, just showing you that this is proving this is here. And we're talking about state and local government spending. So we'll go down, state and local government spending, 0.06. I typed it in wrong. Good to know that. So this is supposed to be minus 0.06 minus 0.06%. That's what it's supposed to be. So my estimates here, minus 0.06%. So my estimates from using these additional lines were really quite accurate, very close to the actual data. So you can see how this method can get you very close to the data that you are trying to get into Excel so you can use it in your own chart. So method number 1 is to add these additional lines. Works well when the graph that you have already has grid lines, so that you can actually create additional grid lines that give you the ability to accurately estimate these values. The second method will be what I refer to as measure and calculate. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to actually measure the height of the columns so that we can then determine a ratio, because we know how far apart each of these grid lines are. We're going to do this using rectangles. This is another chart from that same report, from that same PDF. I've done the screen capture, put it in on this slide. And by the way, I'm using column charts here. This works equally as well for bar charts because they have, it's just basically a column chart turned 90 degrees. Same sort of features. Now, what I'm going to do again is I'm going to first figure out how big is the distance from a grid line to the baseline so that I know that, and then can apply, calculate, and then apply the ratio. I'm going to zoom in on my chart again here. I'm going to zoom in, go over to our far left side. So first I want to figure out what's between 0 and 5. How big is that so that we can calculate it? I'm going to use a rectangle. So I'm going to use my regular rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle here that goes from my baseline to my 5 in the measurement axis. I'm going to turn off the outline. The outline is distorting because I'm measuring the outline instead of the size of the rectangle. So I'll go to my shape outline and set no outline. I also want to change the color to be a different color than the columns in this particular chart. So I'm going to set the fill color, let's say, to this orange. So that's nice and different. Now I'm going to adjust the top and the bottom of the rectangle to sit exactly where I want it to be on the grid line. So I want to get to the middle of the grid line there, the middle of the grid line, the bottom. I think that looks good. Now, when I select the rectangle, what I'm going to do is on the shape format ribbon, on the far right-hand side, what I want to do is to look at this particular set of measurements. Here, the height is 1.17 inches. So what that means is when I have 1.17 inches measured on this chart, the equivalent to that is 5 units on my measurement axis. That's what I need to put into my Excel sheet to create my ratio. So I'll go back here, ratio. So the distance is 1.17 inches, and the value that represented was 5. So my ratio is going to figure out how much value is there per inch of distance. So my formula here is going to be equals my value divided by my distance. So I know for every inch on the chart, it's 4.27 in terms of the value. Now I can go back to my chart and I can measure some of these values. So let's start with the second one here. I'm going to duplicate this rectangle, and again, I want to move it horizontally this time. Shift key works for that as well. So I'm going to Control Shift, and I'm going to drag it to the side here. I know the bottom is where I want it to be. Now the top, I just need to adjust the top here to get to the top of this column. Let me check. Oh, that looks pretty close. It's a little fuzzy because of the lower resolution. Oh, that maybe went a little too far. So let me pull that down a bit. There we go. I think that's a good estimate. Again, by zooming in, we can get the best estimate. Now I take a look up in the top right corner here. The height, 2.5 inches. Okay, 2.5 inches. Go back to my Excel sheet. The distance for this particular one, which one was that? Let's just go down. Which one was that? That was 2021 Q2. Of course, it's one of the ones that we don't have the actual value for. So let's take a look at another one. I'm going to move over in our chart, one that we do have the value for, which is the next one here. And I'll Control Shift, drag this over, adjust my height. So it's the same process. The first one just showed you the process. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So what is that one? My shape format, 0.82 inches. And that is 2021 Q3. So 0.82 inches. 0.82 inches. And my next one, well, let's go 2 over because that's a negative one. Let's do that one. Control Shift, move that over. And in this case, I'm going to have to adjust both the top and the bottom because it's negative. Oh, a little bit more here. That looks pretty good. And this one is 0.53, and I know that's negative. So minus 0.53 inches. To get my estimate, I use my ratio. So remember, our ratio is 4.27 for each inch. I'm going to set up my formula that says equals the distance multiplied by my ratio, and I want to lock that ratio in. Now copy that formula for my next one so that I can see what those are. Now let's take a look at the data from the source. Here's the data from the source. Copy, paste that here. And indeed, very, very close. So instead of 3.4% the actual, 3.5, instead of minus 2.2, minus 2.26. So very, very close estimates using this technique of drawing a rectangle, creating what the ratio is, then duplicating that rectangle to be able to figure out the sizes of each of the other columns. Again, this can work well, just a different method for you to use. Creating the ratio, then measuring each of the columns, and using that ratio to determine, based on the height of the column, what the value is in the graph. Now, how do we deal with graphs that don't have grid lines? This is this first example that I copied and from the website, and this doesn't have grid lines, so it makes it harder. How do we actually create major grid lines using the numbers that are on this graph to be able to use one of those other methods that I've gone through? Well, the easiest way I've found to do this is to know that where these numbers are positioned on the measurement axis, the vertical axis here on a column graph, the middle of that number is where that particular grid line would normally be positioned. So if we take a look at this, indeed the middle of the number is where the grid line is. So we can create these major grid lines in this way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a rectangle around this number and then position a line in the middle of it, and that'll create my grid lines for the chart. So I'm going to zoom in again on my numbers here. And we'll start with the number 6 here. And I'm going to use a rectangle, my regular rectangle shape. I'm going to draw a rectangle around this number. And what I want to do is I want to make that rectangle exactly the same height as the number using the outline. So I'll set, when I'm taking a look at my settings here for shape fill and shape outline, I'm going to set the shape fill to no fill so I can see it. And I'm going to set the shape outline. I'm going to use the black here. And I'm going to set the weight or the thickness of it to the smallest I can possibly do, 1/4 point. Now I can see this particular shape and I can move it to make sure that it's exactly the same height as my number. So I'm moving it a little bit. It's a little too high. Let me move it down with my control arrow here. Let's see. That looks pretty darn good. Now what I need is I need a horizontal line that I can position in the middle of this rectangle. This is where the alignment tools within PowerPoint are going to be very, very helpful for us. I'm going to use my regular line, and again, I'm going to use a perfectly horizontal line, so I'll hold the Shift key down first and draw a perfectly horizontal line. I happen to have drawn that really nicely, so let me move it off a bit. I'm going to set the shape outline again to my black and to my very thinnest weight of 1/4 point. Now what I'm going to do is I need to position this particular line in the middle of that rectangle. Not the top or bottom, but the middle so that it's in the correct spot. I'm going to select both of these items. Again, I can control click on them, or I can use the selection pane that you saw earlier in this video. I'm going to go to my alignment tools again on my shape format ribbon. In this case, I'm going to select the one, and here's where these little icons that it shows are really helpful for you. Align middle. So align that to the middle, and you'll notice how the line went to the middle of the rectangle around the number. Now again, just like before, I'm going to group them so they become one group. I now have my first grid line. To create the next grid line, I simply duplicate this group, move it down so that it covers the next number, let's say 4. So I'm going to Control Shift, I'm going to duplicate this down and move it. Oh, that looks pretty good. So now I have major grid lines. I can add them to each of the other numbers and then use one of the two methods that we've already gone through to now estimate the values for the columns in this graph. You can do this when you don't have grid lines. Most graphs hopefully will have grid lines. You can use one of the methods without having to do this, but when you need to, this can be done. So you can certainly use this for column graphs or bar graphs. You would just use a vertical line and put it in the center of the rectangle instead of what we did here for the column graph. We've talked about column graphs and bar graphs. What about a line graph? Line graphs cause a bit of a problem in that when you have values that create pretty much a straight line or close to a straight line, like this section here on this line, how do we know where that point is? We know 2021 Q4, but how do we know where that point actually is? We don't really know. So we have to use a technique similar to the one I just showed you for charts that do not have grid lines. is to create a vertical line here so we can see where the intersection point is between the line on the line chart and the category label. We're going to draw a rectangle around the category label, then draw a vertical line so we know where that intersection is. Again, with line charts, like when we saw with these axes labels here, the vertical line would be in the middle of where that category label is. I can zoom in on our category label. I'm going to have to go down to the bottom here for this, all the way to the bottom. And I'm going to do a similar thing. So I'm going to use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle around the text for that category label, making it just as big, in this case just as wide as the text. Again, I'm going to set my shape fill to no fill, my shape outline to the black, and set the weight to be very thin. I want to make sure that it is centered. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now again, I'm going to draw my vertical line. I can zoom out a bit here because I do want to make sure my vertical line goes far enough up on the chart. I'll grab my line tool, and I'm going to draw a vertical line. Again, I'm going to hold the shift key down on my keyboard and draw my vertical line all the way down. I'll set my outline again to the black and that very thin 1/4 point. I've got my vertical line. I have my rectangle. I'll select both of them and use on the alignment this time, I'm going to use the item that says align center. So again, this is an alignment where the vertical is what we're trying, the horizontal is what we're trying to deal with. So I'm going to say align center, and it moves it over. Now, you'll notice what happened here is because the line wasn't close to the rectangle, it moved the rectangle as well. So sometimes what you're going to have to do is after you group them, is to move it back to where you want it to be. So I could drag it, or I can use my arrow keys on my keyboard, which is what I'm doing right now, to move it a little bit at a time. And I think I've got that where I want it to be. So now I know where that point is. To show you what this would look like, I'm going to duplicate it over to the next one to the right. So Control Shift, drag the group across. And you'll notice it's quite accurate in terms of where that line, the vertical line here, intersects the dotted or the colored lines on our chart. So on our line graph, we now know where each of the points is on the line. We can use the same techniques as we did before to see where does that intersection lie and estimate the value from that intersection of the vertical line that we've added and the line that's on the line graph. If you're dealing with a stacked column graph or a stacked bar chart, one of the things I suggest you do is instead of trying to measure each of the segments in and of themselves, to measure the bottom segments and then measure the total from the bottom up to the top of each of the segments. Then just simply do the subtraction. I find that makes it easier, and then we know the bottom is always at the same spot and we're being more consistent in our measuring. So if you have a stacked chart, that's a tip for dealing with the stacked charts, that we have to estimate the values of each of the segments individually. Sometimes you're going to deal with a chart where it's pretty obvious that this chart does not start at 0, because this dark blue is about 2/3 the size of the light blue, but the increase isn't, third or 50%. It's only 7.8%. This happens sometimes when the person who creates a chart is trying to make it look better than it really is. So in this case, you're going to have to do some calculation. You're going to have to figure out what that bottom axis is. And here's where that ratio comes in valuable, because we can do the ratio because we have two known values. We can figure out what the distance is, what the ratio is, and then determine what that beginning value was when they created the chart. Then you just have to add that in when you're doing your calculations. So just keep an eye out for that, because sometimes it can be something that will cause your estimates to be off And if they don't include any sort of a measurement axis, that's a clue you should be looking out for whether that measurement axis actually starts at 0 or not. So there are some methods and some approaches you can use to accurately estimate the value from a column, bar, or even a line or a stacked column, stacked bar chart when all you have is an image. See, these are the type of practical things that I teach in my financial viz courses. I teach financial and business professionals how to select the right visuals and then how to efficiently create them in the tools they already have, Excel and PowerPoint, and be able to deliver those presentations to executives. And those executives then are going to take action because it's such a clear communication of the message. It's done visually. If you want to create these type of effective presentation, get in touch. We can talk about a customized course for you and your colleagues that allows you to create effective financial and business presentations.